Okay, welcome back. And now we are going to continue on with the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system affects a lot of organs in our body, and it is also known as the fight or flight part of the autonomic nervous system. In other words, it's the part of your nervous system that sort of kicks in if you were walking down a dark street late at night and somebody came up with you and with a gun, and you would sit there for a split second trying to decide, is this a child? Can I fight him and get it away, or should I just turn tail and run? Okay. And so if you envision what would have to happen to your body for you to have a good fight or for you to run away successfully, that's what's going to be happening in your body. So stopping to think about that, your heart rate would go up. Okay, and as a result of that, your blood pressure would also increase. Now your airways would dilate. The smooth muscle in your airways would relax so that you could get more air into your lungs for your breathing to send more oxygen to your body, to your skeletal muscles for running away. And because you want to find some hiding place far away, it makes sense that your pupils would be dilating for far vision. As I alluded to before, we are going to dilate our bronchi. We're also going to dilate our blood vessels going to our skeletal muscles so we can increase blood flow there. On the other hand, we do not need to dilate blood vessels to our digestive system because we don't need to we're not going to stop and have a snack on the way. So we're not going to increase blood flow to the gut. However, the liver will release glucose, which gives us, it breaks down the glycogen, gives us the glucose so that we have an energy source so we can make lots of ATP so those skeletal muscles can contract. So since we're not going to be doing digestion, our digestive secretions go down. And here's an interesting thing. Your sympathetic nervous system is responsible for giving you your orgasm. So it's very much necessary for a satisfactory sex life. And what is also important to remember is at the post-ganglionic neuron, norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter there. At the preganglionic neuron, it's still acetylcholine. So looking at the sympathetic nervous system, these nerves are coming off the spinal cord in a thoracolumbar location, T1 through 12, and then like the L1, L2 area. And their cell bodies are in those lateral horns. So that's where the preganglionic cell body is located. From there, it's going to go to a sympathetic chain. From there, it's going to go to a sympathetic ganglion. Okay. So if we look at what's happening, as you recall, we said the ganglia is going to be close to the spinal cord because in the sympathetic nervous system, it's short then long, all right? And so this is showing the path of the sympathetic neuron and how it's going to exit with the spinal nerve, and then it can go through the white ramus communicans to a sympathetic ganglion, and then axons can exit through the gray ramus communicans. So ramus communicans is the single form, rama communicantes was the plural form, which I think I used this semester. So these can be called afferent or efferent. White is referring to the fact that the preganglionic neuron is myelinated. Gray referring to the fact that the post-ganglionic neuron is unmyelinated. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit closer. So there are the rami communicantes, or in English, the communicating rami. And this ganglion, this sympathetic ganglion, sits right adjacent to the body of the vertebrae, so that the preganglionic neuron is about ½ an inch to an inch long. It comes out of the spinal cord and just kind of makes a curve right there to the spine. and forms something called the sympathetic chain or the sympathetic trunk, okay? And this chain of neurons and ganglion extends all the way from the neck area down to the coccyx, realizing, of course, the preganglionic neurons only came from T1 through L2, but the ganglia themselves go the entire length of the spine. And so we have this sympathetic chain or sympathetic trunk, and along it we have these ganglia. So this is the drawing on the far left is showing it in the thoracic area with the diaphragm here at the bottom, whereas the picture in the middle, this is showing it in the abdominal area because here's the aorta and it's branching to go into the lower extremities. And so these are the bodies of lumbar vertebrae, and you clearly can see the swelling for each of these sympathetic trunk ganglia. So the entire process is a sympathetic chain with its ganglia. All right, now here's something else that's very unique about the sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal medulla is also involved. So not only do we have those sympathetic ganglia right next to the spine, we are going to have the adrenal medulla. And so if you don't know where the adrenal gland is, it's a triangular organ that sits just on the superior surface of the kidneys in the back of your abdomen. And if you cut it in half, there's an outer cortex, which has a lot to do with the endocrine system, which we're not talking about today. But in the adrenal medulla, this functions essentially as a sympathetic ganglion. In fact, these are modified neurons that migrated here when you were still a fetus. And the reason why I say they're modified is because the cells are like the cell bodies of neurons, but there's no dendrites and there's no axons on them. And so the preganglionic sympathetic fibers are going to travel here to the adrenal medulla, release the acetylcholine, and going to cause these cells to secrete their neurotransmitter. And their neurotransmitters that they're going to secrete go into the bloodstream. So they're not going to an effector organ at the end of an axon, because there's no axons. So it releases them through exocytosis, and they travel in the bloodstream, and then the bloodstream can carry it all throughout your body to give you a widespread sympathetic response, okay? And so since these neurotransmitters being released by the adrenal medulla travel in the blood, we don't call them neurotransmitters anymore. We call this group of chemicals catecholamines. And there are 3 different ones: epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine, but dopamine is such a tiny minority that we are not going to pay attention to it at all. So we're going to talk about epinephrine and norepinephrine being released into the blood. And because they're being released into blood, traveling to their target organ with its receptor, that's exactly what happens in the endocrine system. So in this case, it's acting the same way a hormone acts, rather than how a neurotransmitter acts. All right. So when we look at the sympathetic nerves, there's 4 different pathways that these preganglionic and postganglionic neurons can travel. And so let's go through them one at a time to make sure you understand it. The first was the first one I alluded to, and this is what's called the spinal nerve pathway, where the preganglionic axon exits and is going to travel with the spinal nerve. It can stay at the same level, it can go up, it can descend. It's going to go into the sympathetic trunk, where it is going to synapse in one of the ganglia on the sympathetic trunk. Okay, so because we have all the preganglionics coming out from T1 through L2, but the ganglia are all the way from the cervical area down to the sacral area, you know that some have to ascend and some have to descend. So after it synapses in the sympathetic trunk, and I need to put my glasses on to see this, to find the synapse, okay. After it synapses in the sympathetic trunk, it's going to travel with either sensory somatic axons or motor somatic axons to get to its target organs. And so this is what happens in your sweat glands, your piloerector muscles, and blood vessels in your skin and your skeletal muscle. It takes the spinal nerve pathway. The second pathway is called the sympathetic nerve pathway. And in this one, it exits the spinal cord as normal. It goes to the sympathetic chain. It's going to synapse in a ganglion, but it's not going to rejoin a spinal nerve. What it's going to do is travel alone as a sympathetic nerve, okay? So there's no somatic fibers traveling with it. And then this is going to go to its effector organs. And we can have a bunch of these coming from different levels, forming a plexus, just like we had plexuses in the somatic motor system. And so this is what happens going to your heart, your lung, esophagus, blood vessels, and your thorax, okay? So think of a lot of thoracic organs are going to have the sympathetic nerve pathway. The third pathway is the splanchnic nerve pathway. And the splanchnic basically is talking about digestive organs that are in your abdomen, as opposed to the esophagus, which was up here in the chest, which was the sympathetic nerve pathway. And what happens in the splanchnic nerve pathway is that preganglionic neuron enters the sympathetic chain, but it does not synapse in a sympathetic trunk ganglion. It exits, and now we're going to call it a splanchnic nerve, and it travels to a ganglion, what was called a collateral ganglion. And we have 3 collateral ganglia, one next to each of the 3 major blood vessels going to the digestive system in the abdomen. The uppermost one blood vessel is called the celiac trunk, so that's called the celiac ganglion. In layman's terms, this has sometimes been referred to as the solar plexus. So if you've ever heard about somebody getting hit in the solar plexus, it's because it's activating nerves in this ganglion. The second blood vessel, which goes to all of the small intestine and part of the large intestine, is the superior mesenteric artery, and that's just below the celiac trunk, and so that ganglion is the superior mesenteric ganglion. And then the lowest blood vessel goes to like the left side of your large intestine, that's the inferior mesenteric artery, and so that ganglion is called the inferior mesenteric ganglia. Okay, and so these are going to make their own plexuses here in the abdominal cavity. This is where the synapse is, and then from there we are going to have a postganglionic nerve go to the viscera. So this one really still maintains, for the most part, the short than long. It's just that the short part is a little bit longer. Okay. And then the fourth and final pathway is one I already alluded to, called the adrenal medulla pathway, where the preganglionic axon goes through the sympathetic chain without synapsing, makes its way all the way to the adrenal medulla, is going to synapse there. And then the postganglionic neurons in the adrenal medulla are going to be releasing the neurotransmitters, which will act as hormones into the blood. And I want you to realize that these neurotransmitters are going to be about 80% epinephrine and about 20% norepinephrine. Okay. All right. So when we talk about fight or flight, we're activating all of these. Okay. And this adrenal medulla pathway with stress gets heavily activated. And because the adrenal medulla pathway will then involve blood vessels afterwards, this causes widespread activation of sympathetic effectors and the effects will last about 10 times longer than the effects going through a synapse from any of the other 3 pathways. Okay, so that's it for sympathetic nervous system. And now let's move on to the parasympathetic neurons. And they, as opposed to the thoracolumbar location, they have a craniosacral location. In other words, for those cranial nerves, 3, 7, 9, and 10, as well, we have sacral roots coming out, spinal nerves coming out in the sacrum that are going to be parasympathetic. So that kind of fits with the prefix para, which means on the side of. So if thoracic and lumbar is sympathetic, then above it and below it, on the sides of it, is parasympathetic. And if you look at this, what you can notice is going to go to a lot of the same organs, like for instance, cranial nerve 3 going to the eyeball, to the pupils, 7 and 9 going into the pharynx and to a salivary gland. And then the vagus nerve, which gets a salivary gland, and here in the heart gets all the viscera in your chest area, and then goes to all the viscera in your abdominal pelvic area, excluding the genital urinary ones, okay? Because it's the genital urinary organs that are going to be innervated by those sacral nerves, okay? So when we look at the parasympathetic nervous system, this is often called the rest and digest, okay? So it has nothing to do with excitement. Think about it's Thanksgiving Day and you've just eaten this big meal and you're falling asleep and it's like, oh my gosh, I just need to go sit on the toilet for a while. And so you take some reading material. So what's going to happen to all of those organs? So stop and think about it, okay? You've got your reading material, so your pupils need to contract for near vision, okay? You're very relaxed, so your heart rate drops, your blood pressure drops. We're increasing blood flow to your digestive organs, so digestion is going to increase. We're going to have a lot more secretions happening in our digestive system. And interestingly enough, the parasympathetic nervous system is also responsible for an erection. So if you want to have a satisfactory sex life, you need to have both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation being intact. And when we look at neurotransmitters, acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter at both the preganglionic and postganglionic neuron. Okay, so this slide, which is just a review for you, and it's included in your packet so that you can compare the somatic and the autonomic nervous system as far as structures, as far as neurotransmitters, effectors, and what kind of effect they have. And so with this, I'm going to go ahead and stop this part and give you a chance to review and really study before we dive into parts of it into even more detail. So I want to thank you again for all your hard work, and I will see you shortly.